They thought he was just another skinny kid with a rescue dog, until they realized someone had been watching every move they made, and that dog had been trained for something far more dangerous than fetch. Before we dive in, if you believe kids like Frank deserve someone watching their back, help us hit 1,000 subscribers so we can keep telling stories that matter. Drop where you're watching from in the comments, hit that like button, and let's build something good together. The park smelled like cut grass and distant rain, the kind of ordinary Tuesday afternoon where nothing should go wrong. Frank Walton walked the same loop he always did, past the rusted swings, around the basketball court, through the gap in the chain-link fence where Ranger liked to sniff for rabbits. The dog moved with quiet focus, his scarred ears flicking towards sounds Frank never noticed, his body relaxed but ready. Frank liked the predictability. Same time, same route, same bench where he'd sit and let Ranger rest his knee on him while finishing homework. It felt safe because it was boring. That's exactly what made them notice. The first shove came from behind, not hard enough to knock Frank down, but enough to send his backpack sliding off one shoulder. Laughter erupted from 3 older boys who'd been leaning against the fence, watching. One of them pointed at Ranger. "What happened to that thing? Looks like it got hit by a lawnmower." Frank's hand tightened on the leash. Ranger didn't growl, didn't bark, just shifted his weight slightly, positioning himself between Frank and the boys. The worn nylon leash dug into his palm as he forced himself to keep walking, to not react, to not give them what they wanted. "Hey, I'm talking to you." A hand shoved his shoulder again, harder this time. Frank stumbled, catching himself against the fence. His sneakers scraped gravel. One of the boys grabbed Ranger's collar. That's when Frank stepped in. "Don't touch him." The words came out steadier than he felt. Ranger remained still, ears pinned back, but body controlled, a kind of discipline that didn't match a shelter rescue's usual fear response. Frank noticed this, but didn't understand it. Not yet. The tallest boy, Jake, a 9th grader Frank recognized from the neighborhood, smiled like he'd just been given permission. Or what? What Frank didn't know, what none of them knew, was that someone else had been coming to this park for 2 weeks, same time, different angles, watching patterns that most people miss. From the parking lot, seated in a faded truck with tinted windows, Walton set down his coffee and reached for his phone. He didn't look worried. He looked like a man checking off items on a list he'd been building, carefully, methodically, with the kind of patience that only comes from years of waiting for the exact right moment to move. The camera on his dashboard had been recording for 11 days. Frank hit the ground, tasting copper and hearing his own heartbeat louder than the laughter. Through blurred vision, he saw Ranger standing over him, not attacking, not retreating, just there, waiting, the way someone waits when they've been trained to trust that help is coming. What happened next didn't happen that afternoon. It had been building for weeks, in a way Frank never saw, but someone else had been counting on. Frank had walked this route so many times he could do it with his eyes closed. 43 steps from the parking lot to the basketball court, 27 more to the water fountain that never worked. Then the long stretch past the playground equipment where the swings groaned like they were tired of children. The Ranger knew it too. The dog didn't pull or wander, he just moved alongside Frank with the kind of easy rhythm that made the leash feel unnecessary. His nose twitched at familiar smells, the mulch under the slide, the trash can that hadn't been emptied since Friday, the spot near the fence where someone's McDonald's bag had leaked ketchup 2 days ago. Everything was exactly where it should be. The afternoon light came through the oak trees in patches, turning the grass gold in some places and leaving shadows in others. A breeze carried the smell of someone grilling nearby, charcoal and something sweet, maybe chicken with barbecue sauce. Frank's stomach reminded him he'd skipped lunch again, too anxious about a math test to eat the sandwich his mom had packed. He found their bench, the one with the crooked backrest and initials carved so deep into the wood you could feel them through your jeans. Ranger circled twice before settling at Frank's feet, chin resting on his paws, eyes half closed but never fully shut. Frank pulled out his homework folder. Pre-algebra. He hated it, but the park made it easier somehow. The numbers seemed less impossible when he wasn't staring at his bedroom walls. That's when he heard the laughter. Not the good kind, not kids playing or friends joking around. This was different. Sharp, mean, the kind of laughter that makes your shoulders tense up before you even know why. 3 boys rounded the corner near the basketball court. Frank recognized them immediately. Jake Brennan, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a varsity jacket even though he'd been cut from the team. Tyler Chen, always half a step behind Jake, grinning like everything was a joke only he understood. And Marcus something. Frank didn't know his last name, just that he lived in the newer development and drove to school even though he was only 15. They weren't here to play basketball. Frank's fingers tightened around his pencil. Ranger's ears swiveled toward the voices, but he didn't lift his head, just shifted his weight slightly, repositioning so his body angled between Frank and the approaching footsteps. Well, well, Jake's voice carried across the empty playground. Look who's here. Frank kept his eyes on his homework. If he didn't engage, if he just stayed quiet and still, maybe they'd get bored. Maybe they'd move on to whatever they actually came here to do. Tyler laughed. Dude, is that the same dog from last week? The ugly one? Frank's jaw clenched. His pencil point pressed harder against the paper, the lead snapping with a soft crack. They were closer now. Close enough that Frank could smell Tyler's cologne, something cheap and overwhelming that probably came from a gas station. Jake stopped directly in front of the bench, blocking the sunlight, casting a shadow that fell across Frank's notebook. I asked you a question, Tyler said, leaning down. What happened to your dog? Looks like someone used it for target practice. Ranger's scars were old, faded white lines across his muzzle and a notch missing from his left ear. The shelter had said he was a stray, that nobody knew his history. Frank had never cared. He'd taken one look at those calm brown eyes and known they belonged together. But now, with 3 pairs of eyes staring, those scars felt like a target painted on both of them. He's fine, Frank said quietly. His voice came out steadier than he felt. Fine, Marcus snorted. That thing looks like it lost a fight with a lawnmower. Jake crouched down, bringing himself to eye level with Frank. His breath smelled like energy drinks and gum. You know what I think? I think you need a better dog. Something that doesn't make the whole park look trashy. Frank's hand found Ranger's collar. The dog hadn't moved, hadn't growled, hadn't done anything except exist in that perfectly controlled stillness that Frank had always assumed was just his personality. We're fine, Frank repeated. We're just doing homework. Homework. Jake said the word like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. He stood up, shaking his head. You hear that? Kid brings his science project to the park. Tyler reached out, flicking the corner of Frank's notebook. Papers scattered, equations falling into the dirt. Frank bent to grab them, and Jake's foot came down on his math worksheet. Oops! Frank looked up. Jake was smiling, but his eyes weren't. They were flat, empty. The kind of look that said this wasn't about the dog, or the homework, or anything specific. This was just something to do on a boring Tuesday. Please move, Frank said. Or what? The question hung there. Frank had no answer. He was 5'4" and barely 100 pounds. Jake was 6 feet and probably outweighed him by 70. The math wasn't complicated. But Ranger stood up. Not aggressive, not lunging or barking. He just rose to his feet in one fluid motion and positioned himself directly between Frank and Jake's leg. His body language was so controlled it was almost eerie. Weight balanced, muscles loose, eyes forward, waiting. Jake took a step back. Just one. Just enough to suggest that maybe kicking the dog wasn't worth whatever might happen next. Whatever, man. He looked at Tyler and Marcus. Let's go. This is boring anyway. They walked away laughing, shoving each other, already forgetting. But Frank stayed frozen on the bench, his hands shaking as he gathered his scattered homework, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. The ranger sat back down, calm, ready, like nothing had happened. Frank stared at his dog, really looked at him, and for the first time wondered where those scars actually came from and why, when 3 older boys had surrounded them, Ranger hadn't acted scared at all. Across the parking lot, barely visible through the tinted window of a faded pickup truck, someone lowered a pair of binoculars and reached for a small notebook. The entry was brief. Tuesday, 3:47 p.m. Third incident. Escalation pattern confirmed. Frank had no idea he wasn't alone in noticing the way things were building. He had no idea someone had been watching this park for weeks and that today's encounter was exactly what they'd been waiting for.
Frank thought they were done. That Tuesday had been bad, but it was over. They'd gotten bored and left. He was wrong. Thursday afternoon came with clouds that promised rain but never delivered. The air felt thick, heavy in a way that made Frank's shirt stick to his back as he walked Ranger toward the park. He almost turned around twice, almost chose a different route. But this was their park, their routine. Frank wasn't going to let 3 jerks take that away. The basketball court was busier than usual. A pickup game, shirts versus skins, guys from the high school Frank didn't recognize. A couple of girls sat on the bleachers scrolling through their phones. Normal. Safe. Frank headed for their bench. But Ranger stopped. The dog planted his feet, ears forward, focused on something Frank couldn't see yet. Then Frank followed his gaze, and his stomach dropped. Jake, Tyler, and Marcus, waiting near the water fountain. Not playing, not talking to anyone else, just waiting. Jake saw Frank first. He smiled and said something to the others. They laughed and started walking over with the kind of casual confidence that made Frank's throat go dry. Just ignore them. Keep walking. They won't do anything with all these people around. "Hey, science project," Tyler called out. "Thought maybe you learned your lesson, but I guess you're dumber than that ugly dog." Frank kept moving toward the bench. Ranger stayed close, matching his pace exactly. The girls on the bleachers glanced over, then went back to their phones. The basketball game continued, sneakers squeaking on asphalt. Nobody cared. Jake stepped directly into Frank's path. "I'm talking to you," Frank said quietly. "We're just passing through." "Passing through," Marcus laughed. "This kid thinks he owns the park." Tyler moved to Frank's left. Marcus to his right. A triangle closing in. The basketball game was maybe 30 feet away. The girls even closer. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. Someone would notice. Someone would say something. Jake's hand shot out and shoved Frank's shoulder, hard enough to make him stumble back 2 steps. Ranger moved with him, positioning himself between Frank and Jake, but the dog still hadn't barked, still hadn't shown teeth. Just that same eerie calm. "What's wrong with your dog?" Jake leaned in close. "Is it broken or just stupid?" "Leave him alone," Frank said. His voice came out shakier than he wanted. "Or what?" Jake shoved him again. This time, Frank didn't just stumble. His foot caught on a crack in the pavement, and he went down hard on one knee. Pain shot up his leg. His backpack slid off his shoulders, spilling books and papers across the ground. The basketball game paused. Frank saw one of the players look over, meet his eyes for half a second, then turn back to the court. The ball bounced. Someone called out a score. The game continued. Tyler kicked Frank's algebra book into the grass. Oops. Frank reached for it, and Jake's foot came down on his hand. Not hard enough to break anything, just enough to pin him there, just enough to make the point. "I think you need to apologize," Jake said, "for taking up space in our park with that trash animal." Frank's free hand found Ranger's collar. The dog hadn't moved, hadn't even growled. He just stood there, solid and still, like he was waiting for a command Frank didn't know how to give. "I'm not apologizing," Frank said. Jake pressed down harder. Frank felt the small bones in his hand grind together. His eyes burned, but he refused to let the tears fall. Not here, not in front of them. Then I guess we're doing this the hard way. The first punch came from Tyler. It caught Frank on the side of his head, just above his ear. The world tilted sideways. Sounds got muffled and distant. He tried to stand, but Marcus shoved him back down. Frank curled forward, arms over his head, and felt Ranger press against him. The dog positioned himself like a shield, absorbing the kicks meant for Frank's ribs, his back, his legs. No, not Ranger. Frank twisted, covering the dog with his own body, taking a boot to his shoulder blade that knocked the air from his lungs. His cheek hit the pavement. He tasted copper, blood from somewhere, his lip maybe, or his nose. The laughter sounded far away, distant, like it was happening to someone else. Then it stopped. Not because anyone intervened, not because the basketball players finally decided to care or the girls looked up from their screens. It stopped because Jake decided he was done. "Come on," Frank heard him say. "This is boring." Footsteps, fading, gone. Frank lay there on the warm pavement, feeling Ranger's weight against his chest, hearing his own heartbeat louder than the traffic on the nearby street. His body cataloged the pain: ribs, shoulder, hand, face. Nothing broken, probably. He pushed himself up slowly. The basketball game had resumed like nothing happened. The girls were gone. A jogger passed by without slowing down. Frank gathered his books with shaking hands. His algebra textbook had a footprint across the cover. His math homework was torn. He shoved everything into his backpack and stood on legs that felt like they might give out. Ranger pressed against his side, solid and warm, steady. The walk home took forever. Every step hurt. Frank kept his head down, praying his mom wouldn't be home yet. She worked until 6 on Thursdays. If he could get to his room, clean up, hide the evidence. The front door opened before he reached it. His mom stood there in her scrubs, home early, holding grocery bags. Her smile faded the second she saw his face. "Frank, what happened?" "Nothing." The lie came out automatically. "I fell off my bike." "You don't have your bike." "Borrowed one. I'm fine." She set down the groceries, reaching for his face. Frank pulled back. "I'm fine, Mom, really, just tired." He saw her calculate the argument, saw her decide not to push, not yet. She was always so tired lately, working double shifts, trying to keep things together after Dad left. Frank couldn't add this to her plate. "Go clean up," she said quietly. "Dinner in an hour." Frank made it to his room before his hands started shaking again. He sat on the edge of his bed, Ranger's head in his lap, and finally let himself feel it. The fear, the shame, the humiliation of lying there while people watched and did nothing. He touched his swelling lip, poked gently at his ribs. Nothing broken, just bruises, just pain that would fade in a week or two. But the question that wouldn't leave him alone was this: what happens next time? Because there would be a next time. Frank knew it, Jake knew it, the whole park knew it, and nobody was going to stop it. What Frank didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know as he sat there in his dim bedroom with his loyal dog and his hidden bruises, was that someone had captured every second of what happened on a camera with a timestamp and geotag. Someone who knew exactly what to do with evidence like that. Someone who was just waiting for the right moment to use it. If you're feeling that anger right now, that someone needs to do something feeling, channel it. We're 300 subscribers away from 1K, and honestly, we could use people like you who actually care. Comment your country below, subscribe if this story is different, and share it with someone who gets it. Let's go. Most people in the neighborhood knew him as the dog trainer who kept to himself. Walton lived in the small ranch house on Maple Street with a neat lawn and a privacy fence, the kind of place that never needed the HOA to send reminder letters. His truck was always clean, His trash cans were never left out past noon on collection day. He nodded to neighbors but rarely stopped to chat. Polite, quiet, forgettable. Exactly how he preferred it. He'd been back from his last deployment for 3 years now, living the kind of civilian life that felt like wearing shoes that didn't quite fit. The structure was gone. The mission was gone. What remained was a sister who worried too much and a nephew who reminded him why some things were worth protecting. Frank didn't know Walton was his uncle. Not really. He knew his mom had a brother who worked with dogs and lived nearby, but they'd only met twice. Brief, awkward encounters where Walton had kept his distance, unsure how to be family to a kid he barely knew. But he'd been watching, quietly, from a distance that felt safer for both of them. The park had been on Walton's radar for exactly 17 days. He'd noticed the pattern on a Tuesday morning while running his usual 6-mile route. 3 older boys, same location, same time window, waiting with the kind of idle energy that always preceded trouble. Then he'd seen Frank, skinny kid with a backpack too heavy for his frame, walking a dog that moved with more discipline than any shelter rescue should possess. Walton had slowed to a walk, watched from behind the oak trees near the tennis courts, and felt something cold settle in his chest. He knew predatory behavior when he saw it. He'd spent 2 decades identifying threats, calculating risk, waiting for patterns to confirm what instinct already knew. So he'd started documenting. Every afternoon at 3:30 p.m., Walton parked his truck in the northwest corner of the lot where the overgrown hedges provided natural cover. He brought coffee in a thermal mug that stayed hot for 4 hours, brought a notebook with grid paper, brought the small digital camera he'd used for reconnaissance work overseas, civilian model now, but same quality optics, and he waited. The first incident had been verbal, taunts, laughter. Frank had kept walking. Ranger had positioned himself between the boy and the threat without any visible command. That detail alone had Walton lean forward in his seat, coffee forgotten. Where did that dog learn to do that? The second incident escalated to pushing. Tyler, Walton had identified all 3 boys by name within 48 hours, had shoved Frank's shoulder. Marcus had kicked his backpack. Jake had smiled like he was testing boundaries, seeing how far he could go before someone pushed back. Frank hadn't pushed back. He'd endured. But Ranger had been fascinating. No aggression, no fear response, just controlled positioning, weight distribution, tactical awareness. The kind of behavior Walton had seen in military working dogs who'd been through hundreds of hours of specialized training. He'd zoomed in with his camera, capturing the way Ranger's ears tracked movement, how his muscles stayed loose even when surrounded, how he never broke focus from the primary threat. This wasn't a pet. This was an operator. Thursday's incident had been different. Walton had arrived early, something tightening in his gut that he'd learned never to ignore. When Jake and his friends took their positions near the water fountain, not wandering, not playing, just waiting, Walton pulled out his camera and started recording. What he captured made his jaw clench so hard his teeth ached. The shoving, the punch, Frank going down.
The dog shields the boy with his own body. The bystanders who looked away. The casual cruelty of boys who'd never been taught that actions have consequences. Walton had gripped his steering wheel hard enough to make his knuckles white. Every instinct screamed at him to get out of the truck, to cross that parking lot, to make those kids understand exactly what it felt like to be on the receiving end of violence. But he didn't move, because intervention without preparation was just a reaction, and the reaction got people hurt. Instead, he'd filmed everything, timestamps, angles, clear footage of faces, actions, witnesses. He'd noted the basketball players who turned away, the girls who scrolled through their phones, the jogger who passed by like nothing was happening. Evidence, context, pattern of behavior. When it was over and Frank had limped away with Ranger pressed against his side, Walton had sat in his truck for another 20 minutes, breathing slowly, methodically, the way he'd been trained to manage adrenaline. Then he'd driven to the police station. The desk sergeant had been polite but dismissive. Kids fight, boys will be boys. Unless there's serious injury or weapons involved, there's not much we can do. Have the parents file a report if they want. Walton had thanked him and left. He'd expected that response, counted on it, actually, because now he had documentation of both the assault and the official indifference. Back home, he'd uploaded the footage to his computer, backed it up in 3 separate locations, and started building a file. Dates, times, witness names, prior incidents researched through social media and school records he had no official clearance to access, but knew how to find anyway. He worked the way he'd worked in hostile territory, methodically, patiently, with the understanding that the best operations were the ones nobody saw coming. His phone buzzed. Text from his sister. "Frank seems off tonight. Says he fell off a bike. Did you know he had a bike?" Walton knew Frank didn't own a bike, knew the kid had walked home from the park with a split lip and forming bruises that would be dark purple by morning. He typed back, "Kids are tough. Give 'em space." What he didn't say, "I'm handling it." Because he was, in the way he knew how, building a case so airtight that when he finally moved, there would be no room for excuses, no opportunity for these boys to claim it was just roughhousing, just kids being kids. Walton pulled up the footage from Thursday again, watched it frame by frame, studied the moment when Ranger positioned himself over Frank's body, taking kicks that could have cracked ribs, broken bones. The dog knew pain, had been trained through it, trusted that enduring now meant surviving later, just like Frank was learning to do. Walton's jaw tightened. He closed the laptop and stood, moving through his evening routine with the same precision he applied to everything. Locked the doors, checked the windows, set the coffee maker for 0500. But before bed, he pulled out a different notebook, the one where he'd been tracking not just incidents, but patterns of escalation. Tuesday, verbal intimidation. Thursday, physical assault. The progression was textbook, predictable, which meant he knew exactly what was coming next. The question wasn't if the boys would strike again. It was when, and whether they'd do it somewhere public enough that what Walton had planned would send the message that needed sending. Not to the boys. They were symptoms, not the disease. The message was for everyone who looked away, everyone who decided it wasn't their problem, everyone who thought a quiet kid and a scared dog didn't deserve protection because they didn't demand it loudly enough. Walton turned off the light and lay in the dark thinking about timing, leverage, and the precise moment when patience transforms into action. Frank thought he was alone in this. He had no idea how wrong he was.
Frank's bruises had faded to yellow-green by Monday, hidden under a hoodie even though the afternoon was warm enough to make him sweat. His mom had stopped asking questions after the third "I'm fine," but her eyes followed him with the kind of worry that made his chest tight with guilt. He could skip the park, take Ranger down different streets, find a new route and avoid the whole situation. But something in him refused. That park was theirs. It had been for months, and giving it up felt like admitting defeat in a war he hadn't chosen to fight but couldn't bring himself to surrender. So Monday at 3:30, Frank grabbed Ranger's leash and headed out the door. The sky had that washed-out quality that comes before summer storms, gray-white clouds pressing low, air thick with humidity that made everything feel closer than it was. Thunder rumbled somewhere distant, a warning that went unheeded. Ranger moved differently today, not scared, but alert in a way that made Frank's pulse quicken. The dog's ears tracked sounds Frank couldn't hear, his body coiled with a focus that seemed too sharp for a casual walk. "It's okay, boy," Frank whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring the dog or himself. They reached the park entrance. The basketball court was empty. The swings hung motionless, too quiet for a Monday afternoon. Frank's instincts screamed at him to turn around. He kept walking. Their bench was 50 yards away. He could see it through the trees, the crooked backrest, the carved initials, the familiar safe spot that now felt like the last place he should go. Ranger stopped. Not hesitant, not afraid, just stopped with the kind of absolute certainty that made Frank's hand tighten on the leash. The dog's gaze fixed on something beyond the playground equipment, muscles tense beneath his scarred coat. Then Frank saw them. Jake, Tyler, and Marcus, not hiding this time, standing in the open near the water fountain like they owned the place. But they weren't alone. 4 other boys Frank didn't recognize spread out in a loose semicircle, phones out, recording. This wasn't going to be another beating. This was going to be a show. Frank's stomach dropped. His legs wanted to run. Every rational thought told him to turn around, go home, call his mom, do literally anything except walk into an ambush designed for an audience. But his feet kept moving forward. If I run now, I'll be running forever. "There he is," Tyler's voice carried across the empty park. "We were starting to think you'd learned your lesson." Frank stopped 20 feet away, close enough to talk, far enough that maybe he could react if things went the way he knew they would. Jake stepped forward, playing to the cameras. "See, guys, this is the kid I was telling you about. I think he's tough because he's got that ugly dog." Laughter from the others, phones raised higher to capture better angles. Frank said nothing. His throat was too tight. His hands shook so badly he shoved them in his pockets to hide it. Ranger positioned himself in front of Frank. Not aggressive, just there, solid, ready. "What's wrong?" Jake spread his arms wide. "Not gonna defend your precious mutt this time?" One of the new boys, tall with a shaved head and a Letterman jacket, laughed. "Dude, this is pathetic. Just grab the dog and let's get out of here." "Nah," Jake's smile turned cold. "I want him to do it. I want him to try and stop us." Frank's heart hammered against his ribs.
Copper taste in his mouth, vision narrowing to just Jake's face, Tyler's phone, the approaching circle of boys who'd come to watch someone get hurt. He opened his mouth to say something, what, he didn't know, when movement caught his eye. The faded pickup truck pulled into the parking lot, slow, deliberate, parking in the same northwest corner it had occupied for weeks. Frank had seen that truck before, never thought about it, just background noise in the landscape of his routine. But the ranger had noticed. The dog's ears flicked toward the sound, then back to Jake. Still focused, still ready, but something in his posture shifted just slightly, like he was waiting for a signal. Across the parking lot, Walton sat in his truck and watched the scene unfold with the calm of someone who'd planned for exactly this scenario. 7 boys, multiple phones, public humiliation in progress. Perfect. He pulled out his own phone and sent 3 text messages in quick succession. The first went to Officer Martinez, the one cop at the precinct who'd actually listened when Walton had shown up the second time with his evidence file. "It's happening now. Riverside Park. Send a unit, but keep distance until I signal." The second went to Principal Hayes at the high school, who'd been carefully cultivated over the past week with concerns about student safety. "Check your email. Footage uploaded now. Live incident in progress at park." The third went to his sister. "At the park with Frank. Everything's fine. Trust me." Then Walton checked his camera setup. Dashboard cam recording, phone recording from a different angle, a small GoPro he'd mounted on the fence near the basketball court 3 days ago, hidden behind overgrown ivy, capturing everything from a third perspective. He slipped a hand beneath his seat and found the leather case he'd placed there that morning. Inside, copies of every piece of documentation he compiled, incident reports, timestamps, witness statements, medical photos his sister had taken of Frank's bruises, just in case, social media posts from the boys bragging about teaching some kid a lesson. Everything is organized. Everything is admissible. Everything is ready. Walton took a slow breath and opened his truck door.
Frank watched the man from the truck walk across the parking lot with a pace that wasn't hurried but wasn't casual either. Purpose in every step. The kind of movement that drew attention without demanding it. He was maybe 40, wearing jeans and a plain gray t-shirt that showed arms marked with old scars. His hair was military short.
His face was calm in a way that made Frank think of Ranger, that same controlled readiness. Jake noticed them too, turned to watch their approach with irritation crossing his face. "Can we help you?" Jake called out. The man stopped 10 feet away. His eyes swept across the scene with the kind of assessment that cataloged everything in seconds. 7 boys, 4 phones recording, 1 kid trying not to shake, 1 dog positioned for protection. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational. "I'm going to give you boys about 10 seconds to walk away from here." Tyler laughed. "Or what, old man?" The stranger didn't smile, didn't raise his voice, just pulled out his phone and held it up so they could see the screen. "Or the video I've been recording for the past 2 minutes gets sent to your parents, your school, and the police officer who's pulling into the parking lot right now." Every head turned. Sure enough, a patrol car was easing through the entrance, lights off, but unmistakably official. Jake's confidence flickered just for a second. "We weren't doing anything, just talking." "Is that what you call it?" The man's voice stayed level. "Because I've got footage from last Tuesday and last Thursday that tells a different story, and so do the 7 phones currently recording this conversation." The boys with phones slowly lowered them, the reality of the situation settling in. "Who are you?" Jake demanded. The man's eyes shifted to Frank for the first time. Something passed between them, recognition maybe, or understanding. Then he looked back at Jake. "I'm someone who's been watching you make the same mistakes for 3 weeks, and I'm the person who's going to make sure you finally face consequences for them." The patrol car stopped at the curb. An officer stepped out, hand resting casually on his belt, surveying the scene with practiced eyes. Frank stood frozen, his mind trying to process what was happening. Who was this man? Why had he been watching? How long had someone been paying attention when Frank thought he was completely alone? Ranger leaned against Frank's leg, solid and warm, and for the first time in days, Frank felt like maybe, just maybe, things were about to shift in a direction he hadn't thought possible. The stranger met his eyes again and gave the smallest nod. "You're not alone. You never were." And Frank realized he'd been right about one thing. This wasn't going to be another beating. This was going to be something entirely different. Officer Martinez crossed the grass with the measured pace of someone who'd responded to enough park incidents to know when things were about to escalate and when they were already contained. This was contained. He could see it in the boys' body language. Phones lowering, shoulders dropping, eyes darting toward escape routes they knew they wouldn't take. Whatever confidence they'd arrived with had evaporated the moment backup arrived. "Afternoon," Martinez said, nodding to the stranger he recognized from 2 previous visits to the station. "Mr. Walton." "Officer." Walton's voice stayed calm, professional. "Appreciate the quick response." Martinez's gaze swept across the 7 boys, then landed on Frank. He saw the fading bruises, the protective dog. The kid is trying hard not to shake. "Someone wants to tell me what's going on here?" "Nothing," Jake said too quickly. "Just hanging out." "That's interesting." Walton pulled up something on his phone. "Because the footage I've got shows a pattern of escalating harassment and assault over the past 3 weeks. And the 7 phones these boys were holding 2 minutes ago were recording what looks like the setup for another incident." Tyler's face went pale. "We were just messing around." "Messing around?" Walton's tone didn't change. Still quiet, still controlled, but something in it made the boys go still. "Is that what you call punching someone in the head, kicking them while they're on the ground, planning a public humiliation with an audience?" Martinez pulled out his notepad. "Anyone injured today?" "Not yet," Walton said. "I arrived before that could happen."
But last Thursday someone was. Martinez looked at Frank. You want to tell me what happened, son? Frank's throat felt like sandpaper. Every instinct told him to say nothing, to minimize, to protect himself from making things worse. But the stranger, Walton, was watching him with an expression that somehow made it feel safe to tell the truth. They beat me up, Frank said quietly, by the water fountain Thursday after school. He fell off his bike, Jake interrupted. That's what he told people. Actually, Walton said, pulling out the leather folder from under his arm, he told his mother he fell off a bike because he was ashamed and scared. But what actually happened is documented here. He handed Martinez the folder. Inside were printed photos, time-stamped and dated. Frank on the ground, Tyler's fist mid-swing, Marcus kicking, the basketball players in the background looking away, the girls on the bleachers scrolling. Martinez flipped through the images, his jaw tightening with each page. There's video too, Walton added, multiple angles. I can send you the files right now if you'd like. You've been surveilling the park? Martinez asked. I've been documenting a pattern of assault after the first incident went unreported. The victim is my nephew. Bolton's eyes shifted to Frank. My sister's son. I've been watching out for him. Frank's world tilted sideways. Uncle? He tried to remember if he'd ever actually met this man. Maybe once, years ago, a quiet guy at a family thing who'd stayed on the edges.
His mom had a brother who'd been in the military, worked with dogs now, but they never talked about him much. And he'd been watching the whole time. Mr. Brennan, Martinez said, looking at Jake, I'm going to need you and your friends to provide statements, and I'll need to see what's on those phones. We didn't do anything today, the boy with the shaved head protested. Today, you conspired to commit assault with multiple witnesses and premeditation. Last Thursday, you actually committed assault. I'm pretty sure that's something. Martinez looked at Walton. Are you willing to provide your evidence for an official report? Already uploaded to your department's portal this morning. Case numbers in the folder. Martinez nodded slowly. You military? Was. Navy. Thought so. Martinez closed the folder. Okay, boys. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to wait right here while I make some calls. Parents are getting contacted, school administration's getting contacted, and depending on what the victim and his family want to pursue, charges may be filed. For what? Tyler's voice cracked. We barely touched him. Walton's phone lit up. He turned the screen so Martinez could see. This footage from Thursday shows 17 separate strikes. 4 different individuals participated, multiple witnesses who failed to intervene. I've also got documentation of verbal harassment and intimidation dating back 3 weeks. This isn't barely touching. This is sustained assault. The boys went silent. Frank stood there, Ranger pressed against his leg, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not relief exactly, not triumph, just this quiet sense of being seen, of having someone care enough to notice, to document, to stand between him and the thing he couldn't fight alone. Martinez spent the next 20 minutes on his radio and phone. Parents were called, statements were collected. The boys who'd come to record a humiliation ended up providing evidence of conspiracy instead. Through it all, Walton stood beside Frank without saying much, just a present, solid, the way Ranger had always been. When it was over and the boys had been collected by furious parents, and the patrol car had driven away with copies of everything Walton had compiled, Frank finally found his voice. Why didn't you tell me that you were watching? Walton was quiet for a moment, watching the storm clouds break apart to reveal patches of blue sky. Because if I'd stepped in too early, they would have just waited until I wasn't around. I needed a pattern, evidence that would stick, consequences that would actually matter. You let me hit me. I know. Walton's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, regret maybe, or the weight of a decision made for strategic reasons that still felt heavy. I'm sorry for that. But if I'd intervened the first time, this would have kept happening. Different places, different times, and next time there might not be anyone watching. Frank understood, even though part of him wished someone had just stopped it from hurting in the first place. How long have you been doing this? 17 days. Walton met his eyes. Since the first time I saw them corner you near the swings. 17 days of showing up,
watching, documenting, building a case while Frank thought he was completely alone. "Thank you," Frank said. The words felt too small for what they needed to carry. Walton nodded. Then he looked down at Ranger, who'd been sitting calmly through the entire confrontation, never barking, never lunging, just watching with that eerie discipline. "Can I?" Walton gestured toward the dog. Frank nodded. Walton knelt, extending a hand for Ranger to sniff. The dog's tail wagged once, just once, and he leaned into Walton's touch with a familiarity that made Frank's chest tighten. "Hey, old friend," Walton said softly. "Good to see you again." "Again?" Frank's voice came out sharper than he meant. "You know Ranger?" Walton's hand stilled on the dog's scarred head. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "I know his story," he said carefully. "And someday, when you're ready, I'll tell you where he came from. But right now, you should probably get home. Your mom's gonna want to hear about this." Frank wanted to push, wanted answers to the 100 questions suddenly crowding his mind. But something in Walton's expression told him this wasn't the moment. "Okay," he said. They walked together to the parking lot. Walton's truck, Frank's usual path home. Ranger between them, calm and steady as always. At the edge of the park, Walton stopped. "Frank?" "Yeah?" "You did good today. Standing your ground, not running. That took real courage." Frank thought about all the times he'd wanted to run, all the times he'd lied and hidden and tried to make himself invisible. Didn't feel courageous. "It never does," Walton said. "Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and standing anyway." He poured out a business card, plain white, with just a name and number. "Anything like this happens again, you call me, immediately. Understood?" Frank took the card. "Understood," Walton nodded once, then climbed into his truck and drove away. Frank stood there for a moment, Ranger patient beside him, the card warm in his hand. The park looked the same as always. Swings creaking, grass freshly cut, afternoon sun breaking through the clouds. But everything felt different. He started the walk home, and for the first time in weeks, his shoulders didn't feel quite so tight. His breath came easier. The familiar route felt like his again. Ranger walked beside him, scarred and steady, carrying secrets Frank was only beginning to understand. And somewhere in a faded pickup truck pulling onto Maple Street, Walton was already making his next call, to a sister to explain everything, to finally bridge the distance he'd kept for too long. Protection doesn't always announce itself with noise and spectacle. Sometimes it just shows up quietly, day after day, watching and waiting, and building the kind of case that ensures the thing you're afraid of can't hurt you anymore. Sometimes it looks like a man in a truck with a camera and the patience to let justice work the way it's supposed to. And sometimes it looks like a scared rescue dog who was never really a rescue at all, but a guardian who'd been trained by someone who understood that the best way to protect the people you love is to teach them they're worth protecting. Frank didn't know the full story yet, but he was starting to understand that his quiet life had been anything but ordinary, and that the uncle he barely knew had been part of it all along. So here's the thing. We're trying to hit 1,000 subscribers telling stories about quiet heroes who don't do it for applause. If that's the kind of world you want to see more of, drop your city in the comments. Smash that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to remember that good people still show up. Uncle Walton would approve.